How you feeling?
I'm feeling good.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, all right, Brittany, it is really exciting to have you on. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm super grateful to be here. Thanks for having me.
Totally. You've been a friend of mine for quite a few years.
Yeah, I think we're going on over 5 years now.
Yeah, and you have a story to tell.
I do. I definitely do.
And I haven't even heard the story yet, so this is going to be fresh to me as well as everybody out there. But I figure before we start, we should just get to know who you are, which is like the hardest question to answer, but who are you?
Yes. So I'm Brittany Gordon. I guess my story in terms of who I am, I'll base it around generally of my story of kind of why I'm here. And I used to work on a very small niche, highly specialized kind of special operations team at Facebook. And it was a trust and safety team. And we catered to Mark and his executives, to legal, public relations, communications. And we handled the most high-risk escalations, live crisis escalations in the world. And so I'm here to kind of just share a little bit about that and bring some awareness to it.
So when did you start at Facebook?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I started in the end of March of 2019.
So right before everything got crazy.
Right before, yes.
And so I guess what was your role there?
Yeah, so my title was Public Relations Escalation Specialist. And so kind of, mentioned earlier, we just handled major investigations for the largest escalations that caused possible worldwide risk and harm to the public. So anywhere from, live shootings, live terrorist attacks that were going on that the public wouldn't even know about because it was handled on the back end. Anything having to do with child exploitation, pretty much the most heinous pieces of content that you could possibly imagine that creates harm for our public, yes.
Wow, that sounds really intense. So you started in 2019, and is this like a new program within Facebook?
Yeah, so it started, I believe, the team started right after, if I'm not mistaken, Cambridge Analytica, so in 2016. And so that's kind of when the org was starting to develop, and it was a risk and response org. And I guess during that time, I had, a few team members that kind of, initiated the role. And then I believe it kind of just morphed into this, special operations investigations type of role. So yeah, I want to say it started in 2016.
Were you aware of what you were signing up for when you first started?
No, I was aware that, we were here to kind of solve some gray area policy challenges, and that we would see, graphic content. But to the nature of the role, I had no idea that it would be at this level that it was, and especially prior to COVID, and then with COVID happening, right? You just had no idea. I didn't.
So you literally had to watch very graphic, really intense things every day.
Yes. So it could be every day. It could be every other day. It just kind of depended. So we weren't necessarily on a queuing system. And some of the contingent or contractors that Facebook hired through other recruiting firms would be on a queuing system, and they would have to generally review close to 6,500 images within an 8-hour period. So we were more catered towards in-depth investigative work. So we weren't on a queuing system. However, within that work, at any time, there could be a crisis that needs to be spun up, and at any time we could absolutely be exposed to very live graphic content.
So I guess, yeah, I've been so familiar with the other side of social media. As a content creator, I'm always freaking out about content moderation and policies and censorship. But on your side, you really are seeing the dark underbelly of social media.
Absolutely. And so, this is kind of like the overarching question now, but that I'm posing. But, content moderators have a very big job, and it is really to keep the public safe. And a lot of my peers and other individuals in the space truly actually really do care about keeping the public safe. And so, part of this question is like, if content moderators are keeping the public safe, who's keeping them safe, right? So when we're working with the underbelly of social media and seeing the most heinous acts that are unimaginable, images that I could never erase and images that I never thought existed on this planet. It really, is just generally a cause for concern, and it's kind of amping up to be a mental health crisis, in my personal opinion.
So should we maybe talk about some of the images that you had to see on a daily basis?
So in an effort to moderate my own content such that, I don't pass along any sort of trauma, I won't get super graphic, but, we had to deal with what it looks like for certain honor killings to happen. And that's pretty devastating. We had to see, Instagram and Facebook have a live, Facebook Live or an Instagram Live feature. And so within those features, our team was responsible at the time to manage, live suicide and live self-harm. So, additionally, with the live images, you would see live child exploitive images or things that are very negative, putting it lightly, happening to children on our live platforms. And so in viewing this information, you have to be very mindful that there is a live human person on the other line that is going through a crisis. And you have to be very conscious of how you manage those types of escalations. So I won't get super in depth into it, but generally speaking, you were seeing people going through a crisis in real time, and it was incredibly impacting on the nervous system.
Well, in preparation for our talk, I looked up some other content moderators and describing what they had to see, and it was horrific. Like, maybe people can go see other testimonies to get, if you want a more graphic description, but thank you for not, because it actually just traumatized me just from hearing these horrific things that the people had to watch. So what does that do to you psychologically?
That's a great question. This is a new emerging market, not necessarily a market, but this is a new emerging field that's happening right now. And I coined 2024 the year of the content moderator. And one of the reasons why I'm doing, coin it the year of the content moderator is there was an article published on the NIH that recently came out in February of 2024. So just this year, that basically states, content moderator, mental health, and secondary trauma and well-being. So part of these roles, and in my personal experience with my own diagnoses, cause post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is a global crisis, in my personal opinion, because this isn't just happening in America. This is happening to content moderators across the world. It's a global crisis, and it does stress the nervous system, and it does cause stress-induced trauma and cumulative stress. And it definitely needs to be brought to awareness. And to your point, Mark, and to your audience, absolutely. There is information out there if they feel guided to go and look up regarding more graphic details of what content moderators have to view. I would just caution the viewer that it is very graphic, and I don't believe it's child appropriate in any capacity. So just be mindful and aware when you're going down these spaces that the things that you may come across may be things that your nervous system wasn't really prepared to handle.
Wow, thanks for sharing that. And that's really interesting. I always thought that it was just a bunch of bots and AI that were moderating. I didn't realize that it was thousands and tens of thousands of people manually watching this stuff. So I guess, could you take me, how does the process work? If something gets flagged one time, does it automatically go to your team, or how does the whole process work?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's many answers to that. And I could only answer based off of my experience working at Facebook from 2019 to 2021. But how it generally, I'll talk about how things escalated to my team first, and then how things generally escalate to sort of like a content moderator, like call center, if you will, right? A center for content moderators. So for my team, we generally would liaison with the internal legal teams, internal communications team, internal PR teams, and internal public policy teams. And they would see anything that was going on through their external partners. So generally politicians, global politicians, any sort of, legal threats that's going on in the court system outside of, the states or within the states that are coming in from our legal partners and our, communications partners. We would have journalists reach out to them, and they would field these inquiries to us. And it would be generally an email that we would receive. And we would then see whether or not it would be brought into our sort of case basket, if you will, and then prioritized, and then it would be assigned to an investigator. So generally speaking, we only managed escalations from internal employees. However, there was a caveat. Anytime that we had to deal with live threats, like live suicide, for example, that's going on in real time, or live child endangerment. There are a few others. I think it might have been violence and incitement, if I'm not mistaken. A few others that were going on. They would generally be reported via an end user. So an end user would come across this piece of content and then would report that piece of content for whatever they're reporting it as. It could have been like, hey, I'm seeing, suicide, for example. Now that would be routed to a contractor, and the contractor would confirm that what they're seeing is accurate. And if that was the case, it would be routed into our system, into our email system. And then we would have, identifiers within the email that would let us know what is going on, and then we would view the content from there. Now, from the other side of the spectrum, with the content moderator call centers, generally speaking, they're in a queuing system, and it's typically, since back then, has been reported predominantly from user reports. Regarding AI, and, I'm sure right now, language modeling and AI reporting is super huge. And it was a bit when we were at Facebook too, is kind of like, how can we solve like a crisis with AI, which was something that was very challenging. So in terms of AI, it's a bit more challenging how back then I was aware of how those were escalated to these content moderators.
Is it Facebook's responsibility to manage all of this? Because it seems like it's just a platform, and you're going to get all of humanity on there. You're going to get the best of humanity. You're going to get the worst. And of course, there's going to be very bad actors that get in there and want to cause chaos and want to show the worst things. Like how much of that is Facebook's responsibility?
That is the big question, right? And I can't say I know the answer to that, because I have ruminated on that question for quite some time. What is the role of these social media platforms in keeping the public safe? And so, it gets really interesting when you're going down those rabbit holes of governance and how much power these social media companies have to kind of govern not only, the content that's fielding on their platforms, and kind of what that means to the overarching world on the grand global scale as it comes to, graphic content. So I really don't know, generally speaking, the answer to that question. I think that's still a question that is still out there and that we're facing every single day. And you see it right now with youth and mental health, right, and social media. And so at what point is it the social media, especially for the youth, at what point is social media responsible, but at what point also, like, is the parent responsible for moderating, you know, the child's content? So yeah, it's a good question. I really don't know.
Yeah, it just seems like if you had a billion content moderators, there would still be things that are horrible to see. Like, there's no way to stop all the horrors of the world, because that's what happens when you have this free platform. You're just going to get bad actors.
It's true. And what's also really concerning too, one of Facebook's largest problems when it came to combating what you're stating is all these spam accounts. So we have so many spam accounts. We don't have any, you know, personal, you know, ID for them. We can't verify their identity. And it's generally speaking, these spam accounts that are running rampant with nefarious activity. It's similar to someone stealing a car to you know, commit a crime, right? So that's a huge area of opportunity to solve for, but it's very challenging to solve for spam accounts. You can see that there are different indicators to suggest that it's a spam account, and perhaps AI is getting better. But generally speaking, with the feedback that I've received from end users and content creators rather, it's not getting better. If anything, they're having to deal with people who are impersonating them, you know, and asking, you know, their audience for money, for example, right? And so that's ran rampant too. So yes.
Yeah, it just makes me wonder what percentage of Facebook is not real humans. What do you think?
You know, if it could be at least 50%.
Really?
Yeah, and that's what I believe, to be honest with you. There were 3 billion monthly active users when I was employed, and you know, monthly active users means that a user logged into their account once within a month period, and who knows how many accounts one user has. They could have different, you know, VPN set up or different IP addresses to kind of add different accounts, right? So at the time, it was pretty high, in my personal opinion, with dealing with spam accounts, that it was pretty rampant, and that most of the time, especially with child exploitation and some of the child type of genres, most of the time they were spam accounts. They were absolutely not real accounts with real human beings.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just in my own experience, I made the mistake of paying for some followers really early in my Instagram. I think I paid like maybe $30 for 3,000 followers, not much. And then I got all these followers, and I scroll through, and all of them have 0 followers and no profile picture, or just one picture. And I'm kind of like, who are these people? You know, it artificially inflates your numbers so it looks kind of good when somebody first comes to your account, but really it's just hollow. And it makes you wonder how much of Instagram and Facebook and these social media accounts are just not real.
Gosh, I know.
Yeah.
That is one of the biggest problems on social media today, are these type of, you know, hollow accounts. And generally speaking, like how I was mentioning with the child, the child type of categories and the nefarious activity happening there. Generally speaking, there's a human being behind these accounts, right? But they're spam accounts, meaning that they could open however many various accounts to share however many, you know, graphic images or whatever they're doing with these children. So, and it seems to me, and I haven't really, I can't recall because it's been so many years, to look into similar to what you are talking about with regard to buying accounts. I don't know if those are user generated or computer generated.
Who knows? I mean,
Right.
have you heard the dead internet theory?
No.
I did a video on it a while ago, but it's basically like more and more of the internet is now not human generated content. And so if you looked at it like a pie chart, the amount of human activity is just getting smaller and smaller. And now it's just bots interacting with bots. And so most of the internet is just not created by humans anymore. And so most of it's dead. I don't know if that's the actual theory, but
I could say that I could see that being true for sure. And, ever since kind of my work injury, I never really obviously I don't utilize any of these platforms. And so I haven't been really well versed into kind of these types of theories that have come up, or really well versed into, different nuances of AI and how that is really interfering with the lack of human creation or human touch versus computer touch. But I could imagine, based off generally my professional experience, that would be running rampant right now. Absolutely. And that to me is a pretty scary thing.
Yeah, I don't know how this is going to pan out.
I don't either. I don't either.
I guess I would like to, if you're comfortable with it, talk about what happened to you and your injury and what led up to that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, with the role was really, I want to say, high crisis. So everything was going off on all cylinders at all times. And the only recollection that I have about a first injury date or something that was very significant that really impacted me was back in January of 2020. Yeah, it was right before COVID. It was Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And I had to manage 2 crises, and I was on call during that holiday. And typically when you were on call during a holiday season, it would just be one person. And so one person is there to manage the world, and anything can go. And typically those days... Are
you serious?
Yes.
One person for all the world's issues.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so you can imagine, how catastrophic that could be to that one person who is there and who has to really manage these high level escalations. And so during that time, that day, there was a Second Amendment gun rights rally in Virginia. It was very big. It was all over national media. It could even be on international, on global media, but definitely within the United States, it was a very big thing. And at that time, we were dealing with a lot of violence and incitement movements. And so we needed to make sure that the public was safe, that there wasn't any sort of nefarious activity or events being created from the Second Amendment gun rights rally to promote violence. And so that was a pretty significant escalation that we needed to keep our eyes on. And it started really during the Dublin shift, because we were a 24/7 global operations team. And in Ireland, they kind of started keeping an eye on that. And when it was turnover, when it was my turn to take over, I was getting, I was getting the download on what to expect for the Second Amendment gun rights rally, when I received a pretty vague email from a Latin American legal partner. And they had sent in a request and asked us if we had a possible terrorist attack in Canada at the time. I won't say exactly where, but up in Canada at the time, and if we had heard of it, if we had any incoming, escalation. And so I looked within, I spoke to my, Amia, my Dublin partner, and we had nothing. And so I spoke to some internal policy folks that were also on call, and there were, generally just one person as well. We were just kind of like sitting there with this information. They never heard anything. And we had to spawn up the crisis playbook. And so whenever you're spawning up a crisis playbook, it is full-blown crisis mode. So all hands on deck. What is going on? Who is this individual? And so we only had a 4chan manifesto that this person created. And so with that, I had to figure out and identify their Facebook profile. And it's very challenging to identify a Facebook profile from a different platform. Like 4chan is definitely not embedded in Facebook in any capacity, right? So some way or another, I found this individual's Facebook profile and the messages that they were sending, voice messages that they were sending on the way to this event. And we spawned up, we had to get connected with teams that were connected with the FBI and law enforcement agencies out in Canada to apprehend the person in real time. And they were apprehended in real time. And so that was the first of me experiencing extreme catastrophic stress, a stress that I'd never experienced in my life before, where it was, if you do not solve this, people will get injured. People very well could get injured or very, very well die. And you only have an hour to do this. It's go time.
Wow.
So that was the first time where I really noticed right after that event that I was kind of not necessarily, I would say kind of spiraling in a sense. Everything was kind of starting to get foggy. I was very sensitive to sounds, because if you could imagine the internal computing system, we would really communicate via pings. So you would just hear ping, 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 and you're just on the computer, very tensed up, and you cannot leave the computer at any capacity, not even to really go to the restroom, because if you do, like, anything can happen in that moment. And so you have to be on.com. And that was the beginning of kind of the kind of stress response that I was kind of managing. And so people would say, like, well, that's not necessarily graphic content. And you're right, it isn't. However, I can't really describe the amount of stress it takes a toll on someone's nervous system to go through an event like that, and the amount of responsibility a person has in order to solve for this in real time. So that was kind of the beginning of it. And then after that, it was COVID 2020. That's what happened. And our team was pretty much one of the teams spearheading COVID for the world. And it didn't stop there. Our team never grew. I think we grew globally, maybe 5 people, if that. And it's a 9-month ramp up time. So it takes 9 months for a person to fully ramp into their position at the time that I was there. So it was just event after event after event. We had to deal with COVID, Jeffrey Epstein, the Save the Children movement. We had to deal with violence and incitement, militia movements, Gretchen Whitmer and her death threats, and various, things sprinkled in between.
Wow, that's a lot.
It was a lot.
That's a lot.
It was a lot.
So you successfully stopped a potential, was it a mass shooter?
I think it was going to be a mass shooter, because in the manifesto, as much as I can recall, it was strategically placed, the event that this individual had was strategically placed on the Second Amendment gun rights rally to prove a point, to see whether or not this individual could actually get away with some type of catastrophic terrorist event.
They were going with the intention to harm people who are supporting gun rights.
So they weren't going into the United States. So they basically used, because they were in Canada, so they basically used that gun rights rally to see if they can thwart law enforcement. And so they used that 4chan manifesto, and they chose the gun rights rally date as a significant date, even though it was in Canada, that this individual was in Canada. They used that date specifically during that time to prove a point, that they could thwart law enforcement, that they could get away with it.
Now this falls into some interesting philosophical territory, because that person was probably going to commit a crime, but they didn't commit the crime yet. So are they a criminal? Like, they didn't, there was a movie called Minority Report where you could like tell the future and you could stop a murder before it happened, but then you're arresting somebody before they even did the thing. So
it could be, I don't know how Canadian laws are, but taken from the United States, it would be attempted.
Yeah.
Attempted, because there was enough evidence to tie this manifesto to this individual perpetrator's account. And then there was evidence of this individual speaking to friends on Facebook Messenger, detailing detailing kind of their plans. So I don't know how they were able to charge this individual or what went on after the fact. I wasn't really privy to kind of any of that. It's just generally triaging the situation, handing it over to the proper authorities and allowing the authorities to take over. But in my personal opinion, it would probably be an attempted situation.
Were you thanked for this effort you put into?
That's a great question. I don't know. I didn't really tell anyone, but generally speaking, we weren't really thanked for our efforts, and which is fine. We were there in our job just to help people, and so we didn't really necessarily. I think, I don't want to speak from everybody on my team, but for me in particular, thanks wasn't necessary. We did this because we cared about people, and we were very, empathic and really wanted to help people.
That's great.
Yeah, but I did add that incident on my performance review.
Saved millions of lives.
Yeah. Well, who knows? I don't know how many, right? Yeah. But if even you save one person from an injury, it's worth it.
Right. Now I'm thinking of an opposite scenario where you guys didn't intervene, and you saw that there was a very suspicious person or somebody that was very potentially dangerous, and you chose not to intervene. Did it ever happen that something bad happened and you guys did not intervene?
So with regard to the escalations that we've had, I want to say no to that. I don't feel that there was any sort of threat that we never didn't look through, if you will. Anytime there was a sort of threat that came on to our radar, similar to the Latin American partner that we had, we would make sure that we kind of give a heads up because it was so serious. Our team took our job very seriously and the public's health and safety very seriously. So I don't know of any escalation that we received or any inquiry that we received that was pretty serious that we did not take seriously and look into.
That's good. You remind me of something that happened on my YouTube channel. I read hundreds of thousands of comments, and every now and then I'll see one that's about self-deleting yourself. And a lot of them seem kind of like people are just blowing off steam. But every now and then I'll see one that's like a real self-deletion note put on a YouTube comment that seems real. Talks about how they want to do it. Talks about, it seems like they're not kidding around. And so I remember this one time I was like, this does not seem like a joke or casual in any way. So I called the police and I showed them the note. I was like, is there anything we can do about it? And they basically said, we don't have the ability to go in and figure out who this person is and where they are. So it's just kind of like, it is what it is.
Now I'm understanding what self-deletion means. And I think that's a great term to describe, the big S word. So I will
That's one of those words that you can't say on, it's a trigger word.
Oh, it was? Oh,
yeah.
I didn't know that. Cause it wasn't a trigger word when we were, I don't believe so. I could be wrong, but I don't believe like it was years ago, but it's been years. So I could imagine it being, that now, but I do like I think you said self-deletion. Right? I just did a podcast a few days ago and the guest said self-deletion. I like
and
that.
I was like, oh, okay. Now, that is another way of saying it.
I like that. I'm going to adopt that because it's a safer word essentially. And although I don't really necessarily condone the deletion of all these trigger words, right? Because I do believe that there should be conversations. Conversations should be had. And sometimes we have to use the right word to describe the conversation that's being had. However, in this particular instance, absolutely, I would use that word. And so, generally speaking, how that would work at Facebook is, at the time, is that comment would be reported. And that would go into a queuing system. And at that time, it may or may not, end up on our team or the safety teams. Typically, it could have ended up in the safety team at the time. But, to your point, I'm sure there are various comments that are left on these platforms that go unaddressed. And that's a scary thought.
because it's almost impossible to tell what's a real threat that needs, like, it's hard to even put a hierarchy of what's the most urgent. You know, you have billions of people just saying stuff every day, and some people just want attention.
Exactly. And so even this is kind of what's interesting with AI too, is as AI was generally learning language, and it could be different now, colloquialisms was something that AI at the time was unable to discern. So back years ago during the crisis, there was a lot of child endangerment content, or not, rather, there was a lot of self-deleting content that was being thrown up to our team. And, you know, AI couldn't discern, you know, I'm going to, you know, a kid saying I'm going to blank myself because of a meme, or they said it was funny, right? So they thought like, oh, this is so funny. I'm blanking myself over it, right? And so AI wasn't able to determine, like, is this a real threat? Is like someone actually going to blank themselves over this, or is it not? And so you always needed generally human intervention to discern, because in my personal experience at the time, and I do believe this is the case, it could be the case now, is that AI lacks discernment. So to your point, who knows if that's a real threat or not at the time? And so the content that we were managing for the self-deletion efforts in determining whether or not it was a real threat was, you know, if it's live and we're watching it live and we're seeing these individuals, you know, do some stuff live and speak terminology live, then we were able to assess that this is a legitimate threat and it should be treated as such.
Yeah, it seems like a real threat. And I'm curious to know, like, how did this, when you left work and you walked out of the building, how did this affect the way you saw the world?
That's a great question. So, you know, I knew initially that we were going to see some graphic content, and that's fine. And then after seeing, you know, many pieces of graphic content and having that, I didn't know I was going to get injured by it, you know, unfortunately. When it came to self-deletion stuff, I was very on edge about that. Self-deletion type of material really rocked my world in a negative way. And it was unfortunate because at the time, there was an individual, you know, the day that I was dealing with the self-deletion type of video, there was an individual who was an employee at Facebook at the time who actually self-deleted themselves at work. And it was very catastrophic to my nervous system. And so much so that I had a friend at the time who offered her young daughters to talk to me, just to have a conversation, just like, do you want to speak to the kids? And I was like, that would be really nice, just to kind of exit myself from this, separate myself from, you know, what went down at work. So, you know, at the time that all of this was going on, it was so crisis. Everything was moving so fast. We had the pandemic. You never really had time to generally take note. And at the time, I was really overusing, you know, alcohol as a way to kind of, and I don't condone this at all by any means. I'm just talking in my personal experience. I used it as a way to kind of separate myself from the work, to be honest with you.
Was Mark Zuckerberg aware of how big this problem was with the moderators?
In terms of moderator injury?
Was he aware of how harmful it was for you guys psychologically?
You know what? This is a great question, and I don't know if I have the answer to. I don't know if there's no evidence to suggest that he was. I do believe that he started writing about content moderators on his Facebook at the time. It was, you know, he was, you know how he's generally interested in MMA right now? There was a time in his life where he was very interested in content moderator work. And I do believe, I never read them, but I do believe there were some, you know, they're very triggering for me just even to talk about or just even read through. any of those posts. Plus I didn't have social media. So, but he did talk about content moderators. I don't know if he really talked about content moderator safety. There was, however, though, in 2020, a class action, first one of its kind. It was a class action lawsuit that was closed out against Facebook for content moderator safety, and how it really tied into PTSD. So he had to have known based off of this. It was a $52 million class action settlement. So it was a pretty large settlement. He had to have known that there was a direct correlation between content moderator work and a stress diagnosis or a psychiatric diagnosis.
So class action, does that mean every content moderator got a little piece of that 50 million?
Yes.
Was it like a couple thousand each?
I think it was a couple thousand, but I think for those that were severely impacted, it was measured appropriately for them as well. So they got a bit more.
What are your thoughts on Mark Zuckerberg?
That's a great question. Yeah, there are many thoughts and then there are no thoughts. It's like the paradox. I don't know if this individual is completely unaware. There's something that was brought to my attention that made a lot of sense. Intelligence versus wisdom. And so I think he's a very intelligent human being, and we all know this, right? And very charismatic, and he could speak to a camera very well, for the most part, outside of the barbecue, whatever that barbecue PR stunt that he did with barbecue ribs or something.
I didn't see that.
It's fine. But outside of that, yeah, he generally is pretty charismatic. And I feel he lacks wisdom. And I think that's where it gets very dangerous, where you have, full-blown intelligence, but you don't have the wisdom to truly, or the gnosis to really kind of make informed decisions based off wisdom and experience, right? So I think there are many things that I question with him, one of which is his acquiring of the land in Hawaii, and your audience can look into that further, because I don't believe it represents community in any capacity. And so when you have a leader who's making, big contributions to the space, whether, good, bad, or indifferent, you definitely want to look at their character, right? And so when it came to the Hawaii case, I just personally felt like that wasn't a community-based decision. And to be mindful of kind of the words that come out of his mouth, it doesn't really meet with action. So he says really good words, especially in his hearings, like when he's testifying. He says words, they're pretty much buzzwords in my personal opinion. It's just kind of like rhetoric, and but they're not really necessarily met with action in any capacity to, in my personal opinion, safeguard human beings in a sense, or have their safety in mind.
So what you're saying is he's not an evil person. He's not like this master puppeteer who is has control over what he's kind of just this. He just says rhetoric. He says the right words, but you made me think of a concept called Hanlon's razor. Have you heard of this?
No.
It says never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. Right. So, for a while I thought that these tech CEOs were these evil, malicious people that were trying to bring down the world, and they were trying to make us all go insane. But maybe when you get a little close to them, you realize that it's just incompetence. Is that what we're looking at?
Yeah, and I believe lack of wisdom. And so with that too, you brought up a pretty interesting point that now, unfortunately, I'm blanking on when it came to Mark. Oh yeah, right. It came back to me. So I do believe, generally speaking, that Mark and some of these tech CEOs are a pawn in the greater scheme of life. And they generally have to report to a higher authority, and they're not the highest authority. And that's just my personal opinion. And that's what comes into like censorship, for example, right? And kind of like the government, and kind of, what the White House is requesting Facebook to censor and Facebook doing that, right? And so it's just like, well, does Mark really have a say in it? I don't know. And so I don't know what that contract is between him and those authorities, or him and the state. If there is any contract, I'm not saying that there is or isn't. I just don't know. I just find that based off of kind of like a general overview, they're typically a pawn in this game.
So who do you think that they're answering to?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that in any capacity. I could say the state or the government in a sense, but in full transparency, obviously, I don't know. I actually don't know. And the only reason I come up with that statement is the level of censorship that we were being asked to do at the time. And so it's like, well, it comes from someone, right? And I don't believe it generally comes from Mark. You know what I mean? It comes from other agencies. And this has been brought up with the Twitter files, that there were other agencies involved in censorship when Jack Dorsey was the CEO. And so I would encourage your audience, if they haven't looked at the Twitter files that dropped back in January of 2023, to really look into that, because it generally is kind of a mirror image to what was going on to Facebook at the time.
Yes, I've spoken to some of the reporters involved in those Twitter files, and a lot of our suspicions were confirmed.
Right.
I just wrote down another quote you reminded me of from Voltaire. If you want to know who rules over you, see who you're not allowed to criticize. So it's like, maybe we don't know who the they is, but let's see who we can criticize and who we can't. And that might tell us. And so this kind of leads me to thinking about the censorship. And it seemed like the censorship was leaning one way. You heard a lot of conservative people saying that there was a bias against them, and that you'd have the gun rally page get taken down, but you'd have a BLM protest page not get taken down. Were you seeing on the inside any sort of bias one way or the other?
So when it came to COVID misinformation, I think I could talk about that. When it came to sort of the BLM, like I'd mentioned, it was so catastrophic. Like, it was so crazy internally. It was not organized in any capacity. I just want the audience to know that, we can talk about this now in hindsight and look back, but during that moment, it was chaos. It was chaos inside of the organization. It was chaos outside of the organization. So in terms of kind of keeping tabs on, which metric that, we're using in terms of like saying if and when there could have been more leniency to one conversation, right, to one argument versus the other, I generally don't know. Things were moving so quickly, but I could talk in relation to the COVID censorship campaigns, and I call them the COVID censorship campaigns. That's exactly what they were. And when it came down to doctors who were licensed medical professionals who originally were able to talk about different medications used to help heal the impact of COVID's symptoms, they were absolutely deplatformed. So there was in my personal opinion and my professional opinion, there was one narrative, and that was a vaccine narrative. So when it came down to anything else that went against that, they were deplatformed and censored.
So was this your instructions?
So yes. So not the vaccine stuff. This is my own at the time when I was looking at it, and I'll kind of give a general overview of why I came to that conclusion. And so it was between two cases that I had managed, and I had managed a case on July 26th of 2020, and it was a video that was going viral. And if you guys can imagine and remember, take ourselves back a little bit to July of 2020 and how, kids were, they had still been homeschooled and everything was pretty chaotic at the time. Things were completely shut down still.
Really? I don't.
You don't recall? Yeah. Sorry to jog your memory on such a traumatic event.
I don't remember anything before 2022.
Yeah, right. Exactly. For me too. Everything was pretty much a blur, that's for sure. But back in July, I had received an escalation that was gaining momentum, and I tried to find it recently, and it was about a nurse practitioner, I believe. She was a licensed nurse in Texas, and she was giving her testimony of how doctors were prescribing hydroxychloroquine to patients, and that was helping cure COVID. And I thought initially, per our COVID policies, that this would violate, because you can't say that anything cures COVID. And I brought this up this was kind of one of the only times that we had second eyes on our work. Generally, we had full autonomy in terms of making our decisions. We were, given the responsibility to make decisions fast when we needed to. And so we never had, a person ever fact check our work in a sense. We'd have quality type of stuff, but generally we had responsibility to kind of make these assessments on our own. This is the only time when COVID was rolling out that we needed second eyes, which was good because, you're moving fast and the crisis is going globally, and there's a lot of content to field. And so at this particular moment, I felt that this was violating because it said that it cured COVID. And I brought it up to a misinformation product policy team, and they got second eyes on it. And they said, well, this doesn't violate because it's a licensed medical professional giving anecdotal evidence. And so that, enlightened me. And I was like, oh, okay, great. So I guess this doesn't violate, right? So we'll keep it on our platform, and life is good. I'm moving on to the next escalation,
On to the next crisis.
Yeah, exactly. On to the next crisis. Let's keep going. You know what I mean? So devastating. I can laugh about it now. Yeah. But at any rate, so the next day happened and I was on call, and, we had an on-call structure, and we weren't typically on call every single day. We were on call anywhere between 2 to 3 times a week. And so I was on call the next day, and I had dealt with 4 incoming tasks to review at P0s. And, P0s are the highest priority that you can give it. And so when you're getting 4 P0s within a 1 hour time frame, you got to figure it out. You need to prioritize.
My God.
You got to prioritize P0s, P1, P2, P3 out of the P0s already. So within already 4 P0s, you need to prioritize within the 4 P0s of
Can you give an example of what the different Ps are?
Yeah. So there's, in terms of genre, categories. So, gosh, it changes with the season, because with COVID, if there was something going viral, and so our team was managing 1 million views within 24-hour period, right? So that's viral. When you have 1 million views within a 24-hour period, that means it's going viral, and we need to address that. So that could be a P0. Anything having to deal with child stuff is a P0. Anything having to do, and sometimes things are a bit mislabeled, right? So it's basically up to the triager. And so generally we had a graph, but some people, will kind of color outside the lines in a sense. And that's okay. It never really thwarted our operations, because everyone is pretty stuck, stuck to the grid for the most part, because every circumstance is different. It's very unique. So you're having to field all these different data points in order to come to the conclusion of how you're going to prioritize this escalation. And so, so it could be child endangerment, anything having to do with live, self-deletion stuff, or any of self-harm, any of those types of things. Kind of the highest graphic type of things that you could possibly imagine, right? Any sort of crisis, like a mass shooting that's popping off, that's a P0. Some people thought that if it dealt with a pretty high, famous, pretty well-known politician, then that would be considered a P0, and so on and so forth. And COVID, generally speaking, was, for the most part, considered P0s. So at the time when I was managing, the day went the day previously was over. I went over to the next day where I was on call, and I had a similar escalation come up. And people generally know this escalation. It's the American Frontline Doctors. It was back in July of 2020. I believe it was July 27th of 2020, where they all lined up in white lab coats and they had a conference. Dr. Simone Gold, Dr. Stella Emanuel was there, and they talked about how they, found this cure for COVID and that it was hydroxychloroquine. And the doctors were describing that they have cured hundreds of patients with it, and that there is no need to be on lockdown, that businesses can open up, the economy can continue, that kids could go back to school regularly, that everything was okay. And so out of the P0s, the 4 that I had, I left that at the last because I was like, oh, okay, I did an initial check and I was like, this is exactly similar to the one yesterday that I had, right, with the nurse. I'm like, these are licensed medical professionals. And our role sometimes was required to view large segments of video. So that video, for me to go through it, would have been roughly 43 minutes. And that's 43 minutes of time that you're losing, right, on a day that's going 4 P0s within an hour. And so I left that kind of to the last because I did kind of an overview and I was like, oh yeah, this doesn't violate because of the escalation I had yesterday. So let me manage these higher priority ones. And so I managed the other ones and I got to the Breitbart one. And, I say Breitbart because it initially came through that Breitbart was holding this on their Facebook Live. And the press conference with the doctors, Breitbart was holding that on their Facebook Live.
Is Breitbart a news? It's a news site?
Yeah, it's a news site.
Okay. And so I've heard of it.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's I think it's a conservative news site. It's
okay.
Pretty conservative, as far as I'm aware. But they were doing a Facebook Live. This segment of doctors were doing the Facebook Live, and then Facebook cut their Facebook Live. And it came through as a Breitbart escalation. That's what I call it for me anyway. It was the Breitbart escalation, but it was the American Frontline Doctors escalation. At any rate, so when I got to that particular escalation, I said, this doesn't violate. And I cited the case that I worked the other day. I was like, these are licensed medical professionals giving anecdotal evidence based off of, their COVID cure, hydroxychloroquine.
Their own personal experiences. Yeah.
This was exactly the same escalation that I had literally the day before. And so I sent it up to Misinformation Product Policy. I was just like, okay, I'm done. And I left for my day. I was done with work. And it wasn't until the next day. So this is typically what happens. When you're managing any sort of crisis or when you're on call, anything goes. Like anything can happen at any given moment. The day could be a bit slower or the day could be raging with tasks, and you just have to brace for it. And it's very challenging to do that because when you're waking up and like you have to brace for the day and you're trying hard to kind of like, brace for it, and it's very challenging. So, but on times when this is what happened to me, on times when I wasn't on call, so I wasn't necessarily bracing for the day and getting amped up, I found myself, in hindsight, looking back, in a depressive state. This is the time when things were really getting pretty significant for me on my PTSD journey, is I would go through this deep kind of depressive state where I couldn't really look at the computer, I couldn't hear pings, the view of the computer, like the screen and everything, I was crying. I just like couldn't manage that. And so I would just kind of go into this depressive funk, if you will. And I went next day thinking, okay, I'm going to do project management work, or I'm going to do project work today. And out of, not the corner of my eye, but basically out of nowhere, my boss at the time was like, hey, we need you on this right now. I was the one that brought through the frontline doctors. I thought it was done. That was my assessment. I had proof. And they said, nope, it went all the way up. I think it could have gone all the way up to Mark, honestly, because it was a pretty visible case. And it was at that time already dubbed in many different languages. It was already, the original piece of content was already fabricated in different languages, different everything. So it had a different FBID. So you typically had like an FBID for the original piece of content, and that would be its fingerprint. And every single content had its own fingerprint. So at the time, we were told that this violated. And this was an all hands on deck, all eyes on Brittany case. And this case actually broke me because
all the blame went to you.
It wasn't necessarily the blame, because I had given proof that, you know, my assessment was sound. Like I was very confident with my assessment. I said, this is actually it does not violate based off of the escalation I worked on yesterday. And I gave a thorough, you know, explanation of it. And then I went up and to the next day, and it went all hands on deck. This absolutely violated. And we had to find every single piece of content available on the interscape, on the globe of Facebook to remove it. And that was the moment where, when you talk about kind of like narratives, and you talk about, you know, one side, you know, being more, you know, louder rather than the other side. I believe that doctors who had alternative methods of treating COVID were deplatformed and censored after this frontline doctor escalation. This was kind of the beginning of it. This was the beginning of the end of having any sort of alternative viewpoints into medications that could possibly help. So, for example, hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. That was generally that was the case that kind of broke it for the world at the time. And I believe that when it comes down to those types of voices, they were censored. Those doctors were censored, whereas doctors that were very passionate about the agenda or the narrative, like the Faucis, for example, and the Hotezes, and all these very different, you know, all the science.
The good people.
Yeah, right.
The people that have our best interests at heart.
Exactly. The scientists, right? Yes. That love and care about us deeply.
The pro-humans.
Yeah. Pro-life, you know what I mean? Life affirming in every way.
They want to help us so much that they're going to kill us in order to help us.
Exactly. They love us to death.
Yeah. They won't stop until we're all just pincushions.
Right, exactly. And so unless you were those doctors, you didn't have a platform. You were deplatformed. And that went with Twitter at the time. I don't know how that went with TikTok, because I think TikTok was kind of starting out their team, and their team was kind of like copycatted off of our team, because people from our team after the US 2020 elections kind of jumped ship to TikTok. But yeah, to answer your question, I know that was super long-winded, but there were, you know, I don't know much about the BLM and who was censored versus not during that time, or who was gained, you know, kind of favoritism, if you will. But when it came to COVID, people with alternative viewpoints on alternative medications were censored versus the others.
Okay, I'm going to have to put on my tinfoil hat now.
Okay.
So who was ultimately making these decisions at the top? Was it, if it was not Mark Zuckerberg, was it like big pharma coming in and saying, hey, you gotta shut this narrative down? Or was it the government?
So I don't know what happened within the time I sent that escalation up with my assessment and the next day. I have no idea how those conversations went, but I know those conversations were had, and things were changed as a result of those conversations. So I know that when the COVID policies, and my team was involved with kind of, you know, helping create the COVID policies. I wasn't in on that project, so I can't really speak to that kind of granularly, in a sense, if that's a word. But I will say that my team was involved in that. So, and that we did pull information like from the CDC. I believe the WHO was also there, involved in kind of shaping this sort of information or these sort of policies. And I do believe, and I could be wrong, but I do believe that Anthony Fauci, they took information from his assessment on kind of what the guidelines should be. And so we adopted that into a COVID policy that was ever evolving internally at the time.
Yeah, well, it seems like we're coming full circle now, and most people are waking up to more of the truth.
Yes. And, you know, part of this whole entire thing now, at the time when I was managing this campaign, I really didn't have an opinion on COVID per se. I didn't, you know, I wasn't wearing a tinfoil hat per se when I was at work. When it came down to these escalate, I had no idea. I was like, oh, hey, this is what the policy says, so therefore I'm just going to follow through. I just want to make sure that my work's thorough. And you have this not idea in mind, but yeah, like you want to keep people safe. And so at the time you're looking through these policies and you're like, oh, okay, we just keep people safe. And that's why my original assessment with the nurse practitioner was like, oh, this isn't safe. Like, this goes against policy because she's saying something cures COVID, right? And then it turned around and said, no, like, she's a licensed medical professional. And so what was interesting within those 2 days is something changed, because something changed. This escalation got so big, so huge. They character assassinated Stella Emanuel, which is really curious because this was during the whole BLM movement. And
I think I remember this video.
Yes.
Yeah, she was a African-American doctor. She was speaking in front of like a government building with a bunch of other doctors behind her. Yeah, I remember this.
And then
video.
They character assassinated her. They basically persecuted her. All media persecuted her. And this is during the BLM protesting time. And so it was really confusing to me because I was like, this is, you know, a black, you know, woman who is who cares about people, who wants to help save people, and people, you know, news media outlets were completely maiming her. It was insane. Yeah. It was insane, and it went completely viral. And to my opinion, that was the beginning of the end for any sort of alternative solutions. It went full blown, one narrative. It was incredibly challenging for me. Not only the stress of the role in that moment was incredibly challenging because you want to keep people safe. That's what the role is. And then when you find out that there's two disparaging opinions, or two differing opinions rather, on the same type of policy, right? One was okay the day before, literally one day before, one was okay. And the next day, it was not okay. And it was the same thing. And it's like, what changed? And all I can say is that I believe, based off of the write-up I did, because I was in charge of the whole frontline doc. That was my escalation. So I was the POC, the point of contact for the whole organization at that time. So you're fielding thousands upon thousands of requests and pings all day. So it's like ping, 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 ping all day. And you have to answer it because nobody has the back end information. You're the one with the information. You have to answer all of these different things, put out all of these different fires. So something changed drastically from the day before when it was okay to the day after.
It seems like the structure of this moderation leans towards censorship, because as a moderator, you don't get in trouble if you censor something. You only really get in trouble if something comes on your desk and you say, oh, this is fine, and it's actually not fine. That's when you get in big trouble. So it seems like it's just easier if you're looking at the options in front of you. You're like, look, I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to lose my livelihood. Mm-hmm. I just want to live my life. Mm-hmm. I'm going to just say no to this thing and then go on to the next one. Is that a fair assessment?
You know, I don't know. I can't speak to that in terms of my own experience, because I was pretty, you know, in these roles, my role in particular, not necessarily the contract content moderators and the queuing systems rather, but in my particular role, we were given the breadth and the space to truly make our own assessments. We didn't have any overarching person saying like, oh, that's the wrong assessment. And everything generally was black and white at the time. It really was. It was like, is this harming the public? You know, is this content graphic and harming the public? Yes, it was really black and white at the time. And then when COVID happened and all of these other things that happened, it started getting grayer and grayer and grayer. I mean, we would have some gray stuff with the graphic stuff or some other pieces of material, but it was really not that gray. When you went into now the COVID crisis, that's when it got very gray, very nebulous, if you will. And actually with the assessment that I made in terms of this wasn't violating, I never got in trouble for it. It was never, hey, Brittany, you made the wrong decision at any capacity. Actually, on the contrary, I was given not necessarily praise, but I was given a kudos to not only managing that escalation, but actually having an escalation to back up my decision and saying, I literally had this yesterday. This is my assessment, and it's a very educated assessment on what is going on. This is exactly what happened. And then when it became time to, change that decision and to go with, sorry, this violated, I would have still, even in hindsight, going back, make the same decision and not be fearful of any sort of repercussions. Because, our team was so specialized that we had the ability to kind of, weave a tapestry, and we were hired to kind of kind of push, kind of help people. So like we were given kind of the authority to really make these decisions, and no one was necessarily really in trouble at all with these types of decisions.
So what compelled you to quit?
Yeah. So that's very interesting. So I got injured big time, and
PTSD.
Yeah, I got massively injured. I did not know that would happen to me. I had, within our employees, we were kind of like the front lines. And if you think about it, I never came from a military background, but a lot of people on my team were veterans. And so they, it was kind of like we're all together kind of in a unit, on the front lines, trying to make all these things work. And at the time we were so stressed, everyone was so stressed. And I don't know why I became like one of the POCs to vent to. But a lot of people started venting to me about, their mental health, their stressors, what is going on. I had a former colleague who took all their vacation time, which was like roughly about a month, to deal with their depressive issues as it related to work. And so at the time, I didn't know, like, sure, I had symptoms of things in hindsight for sure, but you have to keep pushing. And at the time, like, I was using alcohol to numb myself, and then was using, like a stimulant to kind of work, like an Adderall to kind of like go to work. So it was just like this cycle, right? So you didn't have time to really kind of think in that capacity. But I did have people come up to me and relate their concerns and what was going on with them. And I felt it very appropriate to talk to HR about this. And so I went right before I was injured. I went on leave. I went to HR, and, the woman who was the HR BP at the time, she used to work at T-Mobile in the wireless industry, and I used to work at Time Warner Cable in the telecommunications industry. So I kind of had an idea of how HR generally operates in these kind of sister organizations. So they're very similar. So when I spoke to her about it, I was like, hey, listen, like, this is what's going on with our team. How are we, what type of leaves do we have? People are having COVID leave. That was a new leave, but like, what do we have as a team after we're dealing with these major escalations? How do we kind of recharge, and how do we kind of heal? Like, we don't have really any support. And also, how are you evaluating our salary? Really, because we were doing what we were doing for the world at the time, our team anyway, as far as I was concerned, we were kind of pioneering the space. So it's like, how are you evaluating our salary for this job? What leave options do we have? And she even told me, she was just like, I knew that there was something going on with your role or with this team. I just couldn't put my finger on it because we were very covert.
So something specific was happening with your unit. They were saying everybody in this unit is having a lot of mental health issue.
As it related to as it related to me receiving that information from my colleagues, I was kind of sounding the alarm, because also what was troubling is that some of these colleagues, we had the most diverse team because we had to solve for the most diverse issues. So it makes sense, right? You have people from the military, you have people from Pakistan, you have people from all walks of life on our team to try to manage these global issues, and some of which are on H-1B visas. They're on visas, they're not even here. to they don't have like the safety or the security of an American passport to kind of lean on. So they didn't want to be vocal about this at the time. And so I found that this is a worthy cause. People are suffering on our team. I'm going to go ahead and sort of let HR know, because that's what human resources are about, which I'm actually going to rebrand into corporate resources.
That's good rebranding.
Yeah, I'm actually done with the whole concept of HR, although I know that there are very empathic, loving HR, colleagues out there, and I commend you for your space, but ultimately it's the corporation over the individual. And it's been the case for me and the team members and these content moderators. So I will, respectfully rebrand the whole human resources department as corporate resources department. But at any rate, I did take this to corporate resources and let them know. And they were really, like, as far as the feedback I received, they seemed very, not necessarily troubled, but very like, wow, this has to change. Like, this is a legitimate concern. And then I was going through sort of managing myself until the US 2020 elections, because our team became the US 2020 elections. And we didn't have the bodies at the time. And you can imagine, imagine I never knew that I was going to be hired for US 2020 elections.
Who could prepare for that?
Oh, you just can't.
Yeah.
I do believe the leadership had an opportunity. They had 4 years to prepare a team for this. They had 4 years to figure it out, to prepare a team. And I'm very critical of leadership in general. My colleagues, the frontliners, very beautiful people, incredible people. I love them. And I honor them in their journey. Leadership, they had years to prepare for this, and they just kind of dumped it. As far as I'm concerned, they dumped it on our team. And so not only were we managing everything, all walks of life, like in terms of escalations and managing a global crisis, we were getting hit with crisis after. We were the crisis team that was in a deep crisis. There was no way that that we were able to really kind of manage all these crises with the number of people we had. And just for scope, or just for general awareness, we had like 15 people in North America roughly, and then globally our internal team was roughly only 50 people.
50 people globally and 15 people in America to manage
the world,
all of the election, everything,
all of it. And not only that, they took from our team to manage like the US 2020 elections team. So not only did we have 15 people originally, let's say in North America, they're like, well, let's like pick like 7 people from that team. And then the other 7 people are going to continue managing the world with half of the bodies. And then these 7 people are going to manage the election team. Yeah, so it was definitely getting high off of our own supply.
Wow.
Which creates catastrophic stress to the nervous system. I mean, it is an overwhelming level of stress when you have to be the US 2020 elections team for Facebook. And I was never hired for that role, although there were colleagues that told me that they were hired specifically for elections. So it was not standardized in any capacity.
So what got you to quit? What was the point?
Yeah, good question. So I got injured out. So basically I went to HR. I didn't know it was going to happen to me. And then I started receiving symptoms of opening up. I would open up my laptop to get ready for work and I would cry. I couldn't even type an email. I couldn't even read an email, like what the contents of an email was. It was so triggering. I was just crying and I was like, I need to talk to my psychiatrist about this. So I set up an appointment with her and I told her, kind of like my symptoms of what's going on. And I said, maybe I just need 30 days. Maybe I can go on FMLA for 30 days. And maybe that's what I need, right? And so I stayed through the elections to kind of help with my team. So I was like, okay, I'll take a leave of absence on a medical leave. I'll take a medical leave on November 9th, right after the election, so I can be there to kind of help. And I took that leave. I thought that I needed a recharge, so I went to, Tulum and thought I needed a recharge. And then I came back home and just completely crashed into a full-blown depressive state. And I couldn't get out of bed for a few weeks. And that was the start of the journey. So I then went to a partial hospitalization program. I was in an intensive outpatient program. I was in intensive therapy and this partial hospitalization program for a good 4 months to kind of deal with what was going on with me. And I didn't know what was going on with me at the time. I didn't know really necessarily what PTSD was. You know, I've heard about it, and you just think it's like, you know, first responders or war veterans, right? You don't think that you're going to have first responder level, you know, frontline level PTSD from a corporate job. That's just not the idea when you walk into a corporate environment. And so I went on that journey, and then I tried to go back to work. You know, I graduated from the program. I tried to go back to work, and I just couldn't handle it. And so I tried to quit.
So they tried to put you right back there on the front lines.
Yeah, I had accommodations and my accommodations were to not deal with any escalations related to the US 2020 elections, related to COVID-19, and related to misinformation. Because at that level with the misinformation type of when you're dealing with misinformation, you don't know what's true or what's fake. And your brain gets really like blurry.
I think that's all of us right now.
Right. And it was like that for me. I can't speak in regard to I can't speak for my, you know, my fellow colleagues, but for me, it started getting very gray and very uncomfortable and kind of very unsafe to be in that role, right? Because you have to deal with like the possibility of being doxxed, for example, and all of these other things that were going on. Yes. Yeah. You had to deal with, you know, I was fearful that I was going to be doxxed, that, you know, my name was going to go out there, and that I was managing, you know, I was helping to manage the US, or I was on the team, and who knows what that could have been like, because it was a very charged election season, just as charged as this election season. Yeah. So I tried to go back with accommodations. They approved half of my accommodations, that I stay in the IOP, that the intensive outpatient program, that I can stay in it. And then they denied my other accommodations, which was the misinformation, US 2020 and COVID. And I tried to go back. I said, okay, well, let me try to go back without restriction. And I tried to go back, and I was kind of trying to ramp up, and I couldn't. I had a massive breakdown. I had a panic attack. There was no way I could manage the role. I even went to my mom. And I was just like crying, like breaking down to her, and just saying, I know I get super emotional about this because it was just so gnarly, because this was the end to me of like my career. And so, it was really a rough decision to make, to be in the situation that I was in, but I couldn't do it. And I was very vocal, like I said, to my team members. I let them know there was a team meeting, and I told them about my situation. I told them about PTSD. I told them, like, hey, this is what a nervous system was. I even used my performance review to talk about mental health. I decided, like, I'm going to use my performance review to talk about what I want to talk about. And that's my experience in the hospitalization program. That's my experience in mental health and these roles. And so I was very vocal about it. And just to kind of, you know, warn my employees, like, hey, or they're not my employees, my colleagues, about what a nervous system is, you know, what symptoms are, the symptoms that you know, obviously I'm not a doctor, but I can just speak on my own experience and kind of just bring awareness to that internally. And then it took months for Facebook. They tried to kind of accommodate me. They kind of said, well, no, come back with accommodations, you know, like, wait, there's more, right? And I'm like, no, there isn't, because you denied half of my accommodations. I don't want to work on any of those escalations. I can't. And then at the time, I just figured, like, I actually can't even work to begin with, because they gave me the option to, like, interview for other roles. I was like, there is no way I'm at the capacity right now in my system to even take on another role, to even work on a computer. I still turned off my computer for generally all of my medical leave. My computer was off. It was only on during the hospitalization program, and that was it. And that's how we kind of ended things, because Facebook couldn't really accommodate me. And I wasn't willing to, you know, I couldn't take their accommodations, and that was that. And so that was how that relationship ended.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's very powerful. And I'm sure it you've inspired many of your other colleagues, because this is like a very new position. You know, humans were not meant to deal with seeing these incredibly insane images. I've had the misfortune of just seeing like one or two in my whole life, and those scar you. And I know what you're saying about the nervous system. Like, if you're just inundated with these crazy images of like carnage, your nervous system's going to get just revved up, and essentially like you're either going to die or your nervous system's going to have to like shut that off, and you're going to have to be numb.
And that's what happened to me.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So it was pretty hard because it happened, you know, I feel like to me, it was just like execution style. Like one day, obviously I had symptoms of this. This was cumulative. This kept happening and happening and happening, but I didn't know until, as you mentioned, the nervous system shut off. It was like done. It like broke. That's what I kind of say, is that it just broke, and that was it. And then ever since then, I have been kind of, you know, I had to go through the PTSD journey, and that was very damaging for me to go through, and it changed me as a person tremendously. And you know, I feel more resilient now, but you know, talk to me about going through that experience, and I was not at all. I was definitely traveling, living out of a van in the middle of nowhere, and people could say, oh, romanticize and say, oh, that's a beautiful journey. It's like, no, actually not. It's a survival. It's a journey of survival and getting away from the world. I'd be triggered seeing a mask, for example. Seeing someone wear a mask reminded me of COVID. Any sort of restrictions reminded me of the restrictions that we had placed for the world. No social media, none of that. No TV. I still don't even watch TV. Reading is a bit challenging still. You know, I can read obviously, but I don't get in depth with reading. It's just overstimulating for my nervous system. So yeah, I had to retreat to nature and kind of just be away from literally the world for many years.
So nature had a healing power.
Absolutely. Yeah, nature. And, you know, I lived on public lands, so I was really out there in the throes of nature in North America here in the States. And it was nature and animals. I mean, when you're, you know, confronted by bears, or bears are trying to, you know, break into your van in the middle of the night, and you're just like, oh my goodness.
You're like, oh, thank God, it's just a bear.
Yeah, right.
I know somebody with a mask on.
It's completely startling to the nervous system, as you can imagine, while I'm healing or whatever. But being out there in the elements for whatever reason was also very healing. And also hiking, you know, a very large section of the PCT, of the Pacific Crest Trail, that really did heal me to the point where I can even talk to you today.
I've learned, I did a video about the Hermetic principles, and it's like energy is like a pendulum. So when you push too far one way, you get an equal and opposite reaction. And I try to see the good in what happened to you, because there's always like, the darker the night is, the lighter the morning is. And so, yeah, you went into this really intense storm, but now you've come out and the sun is shining ever brighter. And I think with social media, a lot of us haven't gotten to that point where we've broken yet, but a lot of us have become very numb, and we haven't got to the breaking point yet, but we're getting close. Like, you can feel people's mental health is just getting, it's like running on the edge of a knife.
Absolutely.
You know, if they stray just a little, they're going to end up in a nightmare. And so, yeah, we're getting, I don't know what we're doing to ourselves, but I have heard some encouraging things that this younger generation there's now a movement to just reject all the phones. Like, they grew up seeing their parents on phones.
Absolutely.
And they associate that with their parents being in this numb state. And so I haven't seen this firsthand, but I've heard that a lot of them are casting away their devices, which is good. Yeah,
I would definitely encourage that. You know, because you and I, Mark, we grew up in a very unique time period too, where I grew up not having the internet, like for the first maybe, 9 years of my life roughly. And so I had that time to just not have an internet. I didn't have a smartphone, smartphone. I think the iPhone came out in, was it 2006 or something? I don't know, something around that, you know, don't quote me on that, but around that time. And so we didn't have like smartphones. So we just had those Nokia like snake phones. And, you know, we used them, I did anyway, just to call my mom at high school. There wasn't necessarily hardcore social media that we're in today. We had MySpace and our friend Tom. Hey, Tom. but, you know, and who knows how MySpace, you know, handled any sort of these requests. I don't know. But, it kind of blew up. It's taken over the world, unfortunately, but I do believe in the hermetic principles of the pendulum swinging both ways, that what the younger generation is doing in terms of kind of ditching their phones. I do believe it's a good way to go. I myself, living in an off-grid vehicle and just being away from it, totally support that. I try not to be near my phone as much because, you know, it was really challenging for me to be near my phone or to hear a ping, for example. I was just very hyper vigilant about things. So, yeah, I'm all for it. Definitely get out in nature. Definitely hike some trails if you're interested, or bike riding. I mean, there's just so many things to do out in the world to bring us back into our organic state, into our natural state, into our human state, to provide even resilience, coping tools and mechanisms for any sort of de-escalating a spike up in your nervous system, right? Nature will generally help kind of de-escalate that, and it's a path of de-escalation. And yeah, I'm all for that. That's for sure. It helped me.
That's great advice.
Yeah.
So if you could speak to somebody that's starting day one at a social media company and their job as a content moderator, what advice would you give them?
This is a great question. Number one, don't start these roles.
Okay.
So let's go. Yeah. Let me start off by saying, if there's any individual who is applying for these roles right now, I will say for certainty that these organizations don't have the proper infrastructure in place to manage the nervous system through that. And throughout my experience, obviously, I've drafted kind of what healthy infrastructure would generally look like to support people going through these roles. So I will say that they don't have what an individual needs to be supported in these roles right now. And I would say do not take these roles. If there's an offer to give you a visa for this role, don't take it. Your health and wellness is far more important than a visa. In my personal, experience. But I'm only talking about here being in the States, so I couldn't tell, I couldn't say with regard to another country what their situation is, and maybe that visa would really help improve their life. So I honor that, and I'm aware of that. But if it won't necessarily, help your life in any super significant way, I will say, like, do not take these, definitely don't take these roles, because it will harm you in a very catastrophic way. And to go through the PTSD healing it's very hardcore. That's all I can say. It's a very challenging experience. So those that are in these roles, if you're finding that you're seeing any type of symptoms, obviously, it could be depression symptoms, whatever the case may be, freeze, symptoms, just overwhelm, doom to go to work. It's just a very dooming experience. Go ahead and, I would recommend to go talk to a doctor about it, definitely, and talk to a therapist. And I would recommend, if you're going to talk to a therapist, to get a trauma resilient therapist, specifically in stress resilience. That would be helpful. And if you find that you are having a battle with leadership in making changes, my recommendation, and I think there's a big opportunity in this space, is to form a union, is to unionize, similar to what Google did. And I believe 2021 or 2020, they formed a union. And I think that's where we can find solutions right now in this space for content moderator protection.
Wow. That was well said. That's good advice.
Thanks.
Just don't take these jobs. But
don't do it.
Are these jobs, somebody has to take these jobs though, right?
They do.
And
yeah.
So if there were no content moderators, is there any way for us to self-moderate? let's say somebody posts something horrible. Can the users just say, I don't ever want to see content from this person ever again, and that person almost gets exiled?
I'm sure, actually. I don't really, like I said, I haven't been on social media in years, so I can't recall like what features are in place for self-moderating. But I do believe you could absolutely, you have the capacity to deny or reject any sort of information from any individual that could be, you know, graphic or deemed harmful in any capacity. So a user on the front end could absolutely, you know, fix their social media account such that they don't, you know, view this content from this user or block that user or whatever the case may be. You could absolutely do that. And then I say, you know, let's test out social media's AI and how great it is. And if there were no content moderators and they say their AI is as great as it is, let's see how great it is.
I think this could be a very good use of AI because it's pretty damn good at detecting things.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. So if that's the case, let's put AI to good use. There'll always be individuals, though, in content moderator roles. So those that need to discern or do deep level investigations, there will be, you know, there'll always be opportunities for those individuals. And some of the stuff will be graphic. But I will say for those individuals in the United States who are in these roles right now and want to have more safeguards in the roles, then definitely form a union and just kind of, you know, nicely strong arm these organizations to make it safe.
Yeah, I think we've had this debate before, but I'm a free speech absolutist. I believe that we should have the right to, you know, when it comes to saying things on social media, I think anything should go, but it also is the user's right to not hear things. So if they don't want to hear it, they should always be able to opt out.
Right.
And I feel like that could work pretty well. I have seen an improvement in the algorithms.
Like, you have?
In 2020, I was seeing horrible stuff all the time. And I've trained the algorithm to just show me, basically, all I want to see is like nature and philosophy quotes. That's
Perfect.
it. So that's all I get.
That's great.
And so I'm starting to have a better relationship with social media. I think, you know, it's a tool. It can be used for terror or it can be used for good. And so I think we often lay the really bad things at the feet of social media. Look at all the harm it's caused. But we also don't see all the good it's caused. It's brought people together,
Absolutely.
You know, like Mark Zuckerberg says all the time.
You're right.
So I guess he talks about it.
Bring people together.
Yeah. I do think it's ironic, though, that people like Mark Zuckerberg, these tech CEOs, they don't let their own kids use it.
Right.
They put a cover over their own webcam. They do things that indicate that they're very paranoid about their own products.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Mark Zuckerberg building a bunker isn't about like, you know, community.
Yeah, right.
Right. So these are the actions that we should question as a society, you know, when we give our consent, you know, to enter into these worlds, right? Into these social media worlds.
Well, Brittany, is there anything else?
No, I mean, you know, my message, like I had mentioned for content, you know, moderators, if there are any of you out there that feel that they could use any sort of support or need someone to talk to, I'm completely available, and you're able to contact me through my website, and I'm sure Mark, have it in the description below. But yeah, anybody that needs help or anyone who is you know, working in the space of psychology and is you know, interested in this type of field, I'd be interested to speak with you as well to see what solutions we can bring to these individuals who are really doing a great job keeping harm from us. So now we got to, you know, we need safety structures for them as well.
Totally. Yeah, it's hard for me. I never really empathized so much with the people behind in the underbelly of social media, but you know, I didn't realize that there was this huge group of people that are pulling the strings, and they are doing important work. So respect to them.
Absolutely. I honor their journey for sure. Yeah. And we'll all continue to fight to keep them safe for sure.
And thank you for your journey and for sharing. I think it's important, and you're going to create a whole new field of like mental health awareness. I
really hope so. If, I am a trust and safety professional through and through, and I'm here for, to help people in any capacity. So I will continue marching on. Thanks for having me, Mark. I really appreciate the opportunity to share.
Oh yeah. Thanks for coming.
Of course.
All right. This has been a great episode, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.